"You'll live with me now," he had said, the words a low rumble against the wind's shriek. The statement was not a question, not an offer, but a declaration carved into the frozen air. But that came later. First, there was only the snow, and the blood, and the silence that was louder than any scream. Elias found her at the edge of his property line, where the skeletal arms of the aspens gave way to the unforgiving expanse of the plains. He had been tracking a wolf, its prints a lonely trail in the fresh powder, when the scent of iron had cut through the clean, cold air. It was a scent he knew too well. She was a heap of rags and ruin, half buried in a drift, her back a canvas of such brutal artistry that it stole the breath from his lungs. The crimson stains on the snow around her were stark, obscene against the landscape's blank purity. At first, he thought she was gone. But then, a flicker of movement. Not from her, but from the bundled shape clutched to her chest. And another, tucked beneath the tatters of her cloak. He knelt, his weathered hands, usually so steady, trembling just once as he brushed the snow from her face. A mask of dried tears and frozen blood. Her breath was a shallow ghost in the air. He looked at the bundles. Infants. So small, their faces blue with cold, their silence a terrifying omen. Elias was a man built of the land he worked, hard, solitary, and unforgiving when necessary. But in that moment, seeing the woman's savage body curled protectively around new life, something ancient and fierce rose in him. He did not hesitate. With a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he gathered the two tiny forms, wrapping them securely inside his own thick shearling coat. Then, he returned to the woman. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her from her frozen grave. She weighed almost nothing. As he stood, cradling the broken family against his chest, the wolf he had been tracking howled in the distance, a long, mournful cry that seemed to speak for all the cruelty in the world. Elias turned his back on it and walked toward the distant pillar of smoke that was his home. The journey back was a battle against the elements, which seemed intent on claiming the three souls he carried. The wind tore at them, a physical force that clawed and bit, trying to rip the warmth from his coat where the infants lay nestled against his heart. The woman, Ilara, though he did not yet know her name, was a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He focused on the rhythm of his own breathing, on the solid thud of his boots in the deepening snow. His cabin was more a fortress than a home, built of thick-hewn logs and chinked with mud and moss, designed to withstand the very worst the mountains could throw at it. It stood alone in a small, sheltered valley, a solitary bastion of warmth and light in a world of white. As he finally pushed the heavy oak door open with his shoulder, a wave of blessed heat washed over them. The fire in the great stone hearth, the cabin's beating heart, was roaring, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He laid Ilara down on the bearskin rug before it, her stillness a stark contrast to the fire's lively crackle. Then, he carefully unwrapped the infants. Twin girls. Miraculously, they were stirring, their tiny chests rising and falling with faint but steady breaths. He placed them in a hastily emptied wooden crate, lining it with his softest wool blankets and setting it close to the hearth's life-giving glow. Only then did he turn his full attention back to the woman. With a basin of warm water and clean cloths, he began the grim, delicate work. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of ranching and solitude, moved with a surgeon's precision. He cleaned the horrific wounds on her back, each lash a story of unimaginable cruelty. He washed the blood from her hair, the grime from her face, his touch methodical and impersonal, yet imbued with a profound, unspoken reverence for the life that flickered so tenuously within her. The blizzard howled outside, throwing itself against the sturdy walls of the cabin, but inside, there was only the sound of the fire and the quiet, focused work of a man saving a life. Days bled into a week, then 2. The blizzard exhausted itself, leaving behind a world draped in a thick, silent blanket of white. Inside the cabin, a different kind of silence reigned. Elias moved through his solitary routines, but they were no longer truly solitary. Every action was now performed with an awareness of his 3 new charges. He fed the fire, cooked broth, milked his single cow for the infants, and tended to Ilara's wounds, which slowly began their painful journey from raw, angry welts to healing scars. Ilara herself remained adrift in a sea of fever and pain, her consciousness a fragile raft tossing on the waves. In her brief moments of lucidity, she would see him, a large, quiet shape moving in the firelight. She saw his hands, rough and powerful, gently feeding her daughters with a dropper. She saw him sitting in his chair late at night, his rifle across his lap, watching the door as if expecting monsters to burst from the snow. He never spoke to her, not then. There were no words of comfort, no questions about her past. His care was a language all its own, spoken through the steady supply of firewood, the warm milk for her babies, the clean bandages on her back. One afternoon, she woke to find him sitting by her cot, meticulously carving a piece of pine. He was shaping it into a bird, its wings outstretched in flight. He did not look at her, but he must have sensed her gaze, for his hand stilled for a moment. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and dry. She tried to form a word, a sound, anything. A dry, rasping noise was all that came out. He set down his carving, rose, and brought her a cup of water, lifting her head with one hand so she could drink. The cool liquid was a blessing. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible, yet they echoed in the quiet room like a shout. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and returned to his chair. But a connection had been made, a single thread spun in the vast silence. As winter held its icy grip on the valley, Ilara's strength slowly returned. The fever broke, and the world solidified around her. She began to sit up, then to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She watched Elias, studying the quiet economy of his movements, the deep solitude that clung to him like a second skin. He gave her space, a wide berth of silence and respect that was more healing than any medicine. He had made a second small cot and placed her daughters beside her, allowing her to be their mother again. She would lie for hours, just watching them sleep, her heart a painful knot of love and terror. The memory of why she had been cast out was a constant, cold presence. One night, the storm returned, its fury matching the tempest in her own soul. The wind screamed through the eaves, and the windows rattled in their frames. The twins were fretful, crying in short, sharp bursts. As Ilara rocked them, humming a broken lullaby, the dam of her silence finally broke. She started to speak, her voice hoarse and halting at first, but gathering strength as the words tumbled out. She spoke of Silas. A man whose pride was as vast and as cold as the winter prairie. He owned the largest homestead in the territories, and he owned her, too. He had wanted a son, an heir to inherit his name and his land. When she had given him twin daughters, he had seen it not as a miracle, but as a personal affront, a sign of her worthlessness. He had called them witches, a curse. The whipping wasn't a punishment. It was an extermination. He had beaten her until he thought she was dead and then had his men dump her and a curse she'd borne in the wilderness, food for the wolves. Elias sat across the room, listening. He did not move, did not interrupt. He just listened as she unburdened her soul, his face a mask of stone in the flickering firelight. When she finished, her words hanging in the air with the smoke, he rose. He walked to the hearth, stoked the fire until it blazed bright and hot, a defiant roar against the storm outside. He looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "He ain't ever touchin' you again," Elias said. It was not a promise. It was a fact. The great thaw arrived as if a switch had been flipped. The oppressive weight of the snow began to lift, melting away in dirty rivulets, revealing the first hints of brown earth and green life beneath. The change in the season mirrored the change inside the cabin. With the return of her physical strength, Ilara began to reclaim parts of herself she thought were lost forever. She started by mending Elias's worn wool shirt, her stitches small and neat, an act of quiet gratitude. She took over the cooking, filling the small space with the scent of baking bread and savory stews, transforming the masculine austerity of the cabin into something softer, something more like a home. She would sing to her daughters, her voice growing stronger and clearer each day, the lullabies weaving themselves into the fabric of their new life. One evening, Elias presented her with the 2 small birds he had been carving. They were sanded smooth as river stones, their wooden grain catching the light. He had drilled tiny holes in them and threaded them with leather cords. He hung one over each of the twins' cots, where they twisted gently in the warm air from the hearth. It was a gift of immense significance, a silent acknowledgement that these children were not a curse, but a treasure. He had carved them a place in his world. Their life fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. The days were filled with the shared work of survival, tending the small garden Elara had planted, milking the cow, chopping wood for the seasons to come. Words remained scarce between them, but their absence was no longer a void. It was a comfortable, shared understanding. Their bond was not forged in conversation, but in the quiet moments, the way he'd leave a wildflower on the table for her, the way she'd have a hot meal waiting when he came in from the fields. The sanctuary was becoming a home, and its two lonely guardians were, ever so slowly, becoming a family. The arrival of Jedediah shattered the peace. He was a gaunt, weathered trapper who passed through the valley twice a year, a human current connecting Elias's isolated island to the mainland of civilization. He appeared one afternoon, his mule laden with furs, his face grim. Elias greeted him with a silent nod and a mug of coffee. They sat at the table while Elara busied herself on the other side of the room, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Strangers were a threat. Saw a man down in settlement, Elias, Jedediah said, his voice low and urgent. Name of Silas. Rich man. Big landholder. Elara froze, her back to them, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the counter. He's been asking questions, Jedediah continued, oblivious to her reaction. Telling a sad story. About his poor, sick wife who got confused in the head. Wandered off into a blizzard. Stole his two precious babies with her. His off-errands the reward. A big one. For any news of her or the infants, Elias's posture did not change, but Elara could feel the sudden, dangerous stillness that fell over him. He was a mountain, unmovable, but she knew even mountains could erupt. Heard some men talking about heading up this way, the trapper added, finally lowering his voice to a near whisper. He described her. And the fact she had twins. It ain't a hard trail to follow for a man with enough money to pay for trackers. He's a man who don't like to lose what's his, Elias. You need to be careful. Jedediah downed the rest of his coffee, laid a small parcel of salt and sugar on the table as payment for the hospitality, and was gone as quickly as he had come. The silence he left behind was heavy, poisoned. The past was no longer a ghost, it was a hunting party, and it was on its way. The peace of the valley was gone, replaced by a thrumming, silent tension. The sun seemed less warm, the birdsong somehow muted. Elias never spoke of Jedediah's warning, but it lived in his every action. The next morning, Elara watched from the window as he walked the perimeter of his land, his stride long and purposeful. He wasn't just checking fences, he was studying the land as a battlefield. He spent the afternoon cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes echoing the tight, mechanical rhythm of Elara's own heart. He reinforced the bar on the cabin door and boarded up the small back window, plunging the room into a deeper gloom. His preparations were a grim, silent conversation, and she understood every word. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to coil around her throat. She looked at her daughters, sleeping peacefully in their cots, their faces serene and trusting. They were the center of this new world, the reason the sun rose and the fire burned. The fear receded, burned away by a fiercer, hotter emotion, a mother's rage. She would not be a victim again. She would not be dragged back into that darkness. She watched Elias, his powerful hands checking the edge of his axe, and a new resolve hardened within her. Later, when he was outside, she went to the small chest where he kept his supplies. She found a hunting knife, smaller than his, its handle worn smooth with use. She picked it up. The weight of it was alien in her hand, the cold steel a shock against her skin. But she held it, practiced gripping it, the unfamiliarity giving way to a grim determination. She was no longer the broken creature in the snow. This cabin was her home. These children were her life. And she would fight to the death to protect them. The sanctuary was no longer just a place of healing, it had become a fortress, and she was its second guard. The day Silas came was unnaturally still. There was no wind, no birdsong, only a heavy, expectant silence. Elias had been watching the pass since dawn, a sentinel at the edge of his world. He saw them first, 3 riders, dark shapes against the bright green of the valley floor. He walked back to the cabin, his face grim. "Go inside. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows," he said, his voice flat. It was the first direct command he had ever given her. She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, the hunting knife tucked into the waistband of her dress, its presence a cold comfort. She gathered the twins, her hand shaking, and retreated to the darkest corner of the room, whispering reassurances she did not feel. Outside, the riders stopped 100 feet from the cabin. Silas dismounted, his movements arrogant and proprietary. He was a handsome man, but it was a cold, cruel beauty. "Elias Thorne," he bellowed, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you have my wife. And my children. I've come to collect my property." Elias stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked immense, immovable. "They ain't your property," he replied, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the still air. "And they ain't leaving." Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "I have a writ from the magistrate, you ignorant sodbuster. She belongs to me." He gestured to his 2 hired men, who began to fan out, their own guns drawn. "This can be easy, or it can be bloody. Your choice." The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a snarl of fury, Silas gave the order. "Get them!" The explosion of violence was sudden and shocking. The air split with the roar of gunfire. It was chaos, a blur of motion and sound, but Elias moved with a brutal efficiency, a force of nature unleashed. The fight was a maelstrom of desperate, close-quarters combat. Elias was a bear of a man, strong and unyielding, but he was outnumbered. He took down one of Silas's men with a single, disabling shot to the leg, but the other one was on him, a flash of steel and grunting fury. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and raw violence. From inside, Ilara could hear the grunts, the sickening thud of fists on flesh. She clutched her children, her whole body trembling, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Through a crack in the door, she saw Silas, his face a mask of rage, bypass the fight and charge directly toward the cabin. He meant to take her. He meant to take her babies. The bar on the door groaned as he slammed his shoulder against it. It splintered. Wood cracked. And then he was inside, his shadow falling over her, his eyes wild with possessive madness. "There you are, you witch," he hissed, lunging for the cot where she had placed one of the twins. In that instant, time slowed. The terror in Ilara's veins turned to ice, then to fire. The broken creature from the snow was gone, burned away. In her place stood a mother. As Silas reached for her child, she moved. She drew the hunting knife from her waist, its cold weight now an extension of her own will. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure defiance, and drove the knife into his outstretched arm. He roared in pain and shock, stumbling back, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. It wasn't a warrior's blow, but it was enough. It was everything. It was the moment she took her life back. Just as Silas recovered, raising his uninjured hand to strike her, the doorway was filled with new figures. It was Jedediah, the trapper. And behind him stood the town sheriff and 2 other men, their guns raised. "It's over, Silas," the sheriff said, his voice ringing with authority. The fight outside had ceased. The second hired man stood with his hands raised. Power had shifted, not just by Elias's strength, but by Ilara's courage and the arrival of a world that would no longer let Silas write his own laws. The silence that descended on the valley afterward was different. It was not the silence of isolation or tension, but of deep, profound peace. The sheriff took Silas and his men away, their dark presence fading down the pass like a bad dream. Elias, his face bruised and his knuckles split, barred the broken door and turned to Ilara. She was still trembling, the bloody knife fallen at her feet, her daughters clutched tightly to her chest. Their eyes met across the room, and in that gaze, volumes were spoken. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. She saw not just a protector, but a partner. Wordlessly, they moved to tend to each other's wounds. Her touch on his split lip was as gentle as his had been on her ravaged back all those months ago. The cabin, once a simple sanctuary, was now consecrated as a true home, its foundations reinforced by their shared struggle and sealed by their mutual devotion. Spring had claimed the valley completely, painting the hills in vibrant strokes of green and gold. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. They worked together to repair the door, their hands often brushing, their quiet rhythm restored but forever changed, deepened. A few weeks later, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, Elias stood with Elara on the porch. The twins cooed in a cradle he had built, a sturdy, beautiful thing made of polished oak. He reached out and took her hand. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, a perfect fit. "You'll live with me now," he said again. The words were the same as the ones spoken in the snowstorm, but their meaning had transformed. It was no longer a declaration of rescue, but a question, an offer, an invitation to build a life together. Elara looked at his strong, kind face, at the home they had defended, at the children who were their future. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We'll live here now." This story is a testament to the quiet strength that resides in the human heart, and the unyielding power of hope to take root in even the most brutalized ground. It speaks to the idea that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build through acts of courage, kindness, and unwavering protection. Elara's journey from a near-dead victim to a fierce defender of her own life shows us that our deepest wounds do not have to define our future. And in Elias, we see that a home is not merely four walls and a roof, but a space of safety and acceptance carved out by a gentle heart. Their love story wasn't written in poems or flowery speeches, it was written in shared silence, in tended wounds, and in the mutual promise to stand against the darkness together. If this story of survival, resilience, and the quiet building of a new life moved you, let us know in the comments below. Your own stories of overcoming hardship are a source of inspiration for our entire community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories that explore the depths of the human spirit. And please, tap that notification bell so you never miss a moment of hope. Thank you for watching.